So hello everyone, and welcome to our Waking Up to the Planetary Health Emergency webinar series. I'm Tim Malone, an NHS doctor from the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital, and in this series, which is brought to you by collaboration with the University of Exeter's Global Systems Institute, we've been working through various issues in our planetary health emergency. Please, as I said before, use the chat box to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, what you do, where you're listening from. In Exeter, along with the rest of England, we remain in lockdown, and indeed today the NHS Nightingale Hospital Exeter opens for the first time for treatment of inpatients with COVID-19. It's not so much of a question of out of the frying pan and into the fire, but health and care staff, along with many others providing essential services, may be beginning to feel as if they are being slowly poached. So in view of that, it's always good to start with a poem. And from Riptide's Climate Matters anthology this week, we hear The Rewilding of Stonelands Farm, read by the author, Mark Woodward.
The Rewilding of Stonelands Farm by Mark Woodward. See this, a red flatbed marooned in slurry, a perished tyre up on top of a dead Peugeot raised on blocks, a green trailer laden with sodden logs. Last night's storm has passed, and everything steams as if the world is being poached. A squirrel shuffles hazels, clanging the galvanized tin of a purposeless shed. At the island end of a waterlogged paddock, 5 black heifers wait for nothing they can name. Mystery machinery corrodes against stone, caught by surprise when the iron plague came. On a yellow skip throne, a one-horned quad bike rules this junk and rubble kingdom. Behind a high fence, something happened the planners wouldn't like. A snapped sign says private key. Nothing moves. I wait. And nothing moves again. The earth is readying itself to accept a death, the slow disassembly of molecules. See this. Empty pubs, silent schools.
Food for thought indeed. Now, our first speaker today is Annie Mitchell, who's a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist with an interest in psychological understandings of the links between our environment, social worlds, and psychological distress and well-being. She received the British Psychological Society Division of Clinical Psychology M.B. Shapiro Award in 2018 for distinguished service to the profession, in particular recognising her enthusiasm for bringing community psychology perspectives into professional training and beyond. Annie was clinical director for the Doctorate in Clinical Psychology, initially at the University of Exeter and latterly at the University of Plymouth, where she continues to hold an Honorary Research Fellowship. Indeed, until spring 2020, Annie was clinical psychologist for renal services at the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital. She remains a mentor for the Point of Care Foundation Schwartz Rounds programme, promoting compassionate care in healthcare settings. Annie was also more recently co-author of an open letter signed by over 1,000 practitioner psychologists in solidarity with medical colleagues to express deep concern about the climate crisis and its implications for physical and mental health, and demanding immediate and effective action. The title of Annie's presentation is Waking Up to the Psychological Aspects of the Climate and Environmental Emergency: Trauma, Power, Threat, and Meaning. Over to you, Annie.
It's brilliant to be here with everybody. Thank you so much, Tim, for organising something that's interdisciplinary in climate emergency. Certainly, together we are stronger, one planet and health. I just, before I start, a big thank you to my psychology colleagues, especially Tony Wainwright. Tony and I together are trying to wake up our professional body to the climate crisis. And Tony is going to, where possible, put some of the links that I mentioned up on the chat. I think that waking up can feel like we're waking from a nested dream. We think we've woken up, and then, as that poem perhaps suggested that we just listened to, we're still in a nightmare. I want to suggest that to wake up, we have to focus on our values, we have to focus on what really matters most. We have to stay curious and alert and not back away from the trauma that we're witnessing and that we're part of. And most importantly of all, we're talking to one another.
Annie, could I just ask
conversations
you, just for a minute there, Annie. Annie, could you just make your screen, your share screen full screen so we can see your slides fully?
Play from current slide. Yep.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think I can do that, Tim, because it isn't moving on when I press the buttons.
If you try clicking on the slide, it may move.
Okay, yeah. So, first of all, thinking about the balance to hold between us, between thinking how dreadful the situation is, the climate situation is, as you can see from the left, and as we all want to back away from the horror, and on the other side, the hope, the real benefits that can come to us all through the actions we need to take. If we address the climate crisis in a way that meets our development needs, we all have the opportunity to live healthier and fair, access to green spaces, fresh water, education, without depleting our planetary resources and with less stuff accumulating. As trusted health, we've got a particular responsibility to raise the alarm. Our job, after all, is to care. And I love this quote from the philosopher Joan Tromeo in this wonderful book, Madeline Bunting, The Labours of Love. I do urge everybody to rush out to buy it and see it. As Roman Krasnarek conveys in his excellent book, The Good Ancestor, species that survive are those that protect the environment for their subsequent generations. I think for all of us to engage with the climate crisis, it's really important that we think about our personal experiences that lead us to be engaged, our roots, world events that are just direct and indirect, our role models. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of world events that have spoken to me personally, that have influenced me. I was brought up in the northeast in a pit village. When I was 13, that happened. The collapse of a colliery respawn heap. Children died, and it became clear that the warnings had been there and that the warnings had been ignored by the authorities. The lessons are still relevant. Years later, one of my dearest, closest friends and his wife were among the dead in the volcano eruption in Colombia. And again, we thought that perhaps individuals had ignored the warnings, thinking it wouldn't be so horrible, but it turns out that the warnings were there. The powers that be did not take notice. And I think these lessons really rooted in me about our vulnerability as citizens and the necessity to raise the alarm. I had been enlightened by when I was in the fifth form in my comprehensive school. And she got us to read Silent Spring, which was a transformational book. She took the chemical in task, Rachel Carson, them are spreading false information about agrochemicals, DDT in particular, and officials effectively accepting. I think that's a phrase we can recognise in our current world too. And this led to an international reversal in national global pesticide use. We understand that change is possible when we do raise the alarm. And a transformational moment for me was Polly Higgins speak in a crowded pub in Inverness. And I thought, if a barrister, if a lawyer can create a new crime, what could psychology professionals do? What's the equivalent collective madness? It's been called affluent, but it's beyond that. It's a collective competitive ideology that must be challenged. Psychology risks being a discipline that overemphasises individual responsibility, but we have to remember errors. One of the biggest errors that we see is what we call the fundamental attribution error, over-attending to individual factors or willpower instead of directing our attention to the bigger world. We feel as community psychologists the importance of looking down at the forces that bear upon and exploring and attending to the social determinants of health. I think Lucy Donahue was a key developer of this new framework, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, is here today, is maybe able to answer it at the end. This is an important framework for my professional clinical psychology, helping us to understand the social determinants of health, asking these questions, which we see play out in relation to climate. We're all threatened by the harms to food production and our atmosphere generated by industries, floods, fires, extreme weather, and we're challenged to make sense of this. It can lead to emotional distress, fear, anger, and our responses can range from the unproductive ones, denial and passivity, to productive ones, activism. As psychologists, we want to work with support individuals and communities to recognise that this is a real crisis and we can fight it. The psychological impacts of climate change are already witnessed presence, and as psychologists and as health professionals, we draw attention to these responses, these mental health distress responses, both acute, subacute, and long term, not because we want to expand the idea of is mentally ill or more mental health resources, but rather to sound the alarm as part of our collective efforts to stop the harm, promote public health. The harm is real and present, mostly in the global south, but definitely here in the UK as well. And we know that the harms affect the most vulnerable first. As you can see, I'll just slow down a little bit so that you can read that quote, which captures the complexities of the harm for those who are most vulnerable. Living through climate harm is the most appalling experience and really does compound the issues we are already dealing with. Young people are feeling the harm. Recent report just came out, I think last week or the week before, from the Royal College of Psychiatry, reporting that more than half of psychiatrists are seeing children who are distressed as part of their presenting problems. And it's really good that our psychiatry colleagues are not calling this a diagnosis or a mental illness. It's a healthy response to be distracted, distressed, and anxious about the world. We're a bit concerned that this idea that it's a psychological co-anxiety as a diagnosis is potentially going to be used detrimentally. We're aware that the private member CHOPES has put forward a bill, which is second reading, is going to be in March 21, aiming to make provision to stop schools raising anxiety think we would all be wanting to challenge that way of framing. And there's a nice quote here from one of my colleagues, Rachel, from Exile Psychologists, about how school teachers can do an experience of togetherness and shared action. And Greta Thunberg's asked us, where are the adults? The telling us that young people certainly can't change the situation, although they're shouting out very effectively, we need society to change, down to us adults. The trauma of climate change gives us this existential sense that the bottom has fallen out of our world. Equally of the trauma, you can see there, it reverberates and escalates across the world, families, and across the generations. Trauma is an affliction of the powerless, just as the climate and environment catastrophe is afflicting the powerless. And it's to stop death, destruction, and trauma, psychologists and citizens must come together to challenge environmental harm. As a clinical health psychologist, part of my role is to work with my professionals to think about how we can prevent and mitigate the impact of trauma. We know and understand some of the psychological processes that protect us. And here they are: safety, provision of safety, accepting the feelings, providing kindness and sympathetic support, and importantly, sharing information. In my opinion, these buffering processes for trauma map very well onto of Extinction Rebellion, to swiftly reduce greenhouse gases, tell the truth with citizens controlled through citizens' juries, and to do all of this. And the Power Threat Meaning Framework I mentioned earlier captures the importance of the bigger picture. And you're buried on one of the bullet points there is integration of mind, body, spirit, and natural world. And we will be going on the second half of the talks today, I know, to explore the spiritual aspects of the complexity of our one world and our one health. So back to waking up and waking up to the workings of power. We know that the authorities, such as Exxon, have buried the evidence of the harms, just as the evidence of the risks of the coal heaps and the volcano were buried. The tobacco companies' burying of the information and the knowledge threatened human health, but the current oil threat is to the health, to all of the health. It's a harm that's global in reach. And one of the ways that we can counter the situation that we're in is to approach our shared strength: diversity, citizen empowerment, and mutual assistance that we need for a resilient company. As psychologists, we understand some of the processes that can lead to individual change. There are core factors of therapy, psychotherapy, that Bruce Wampold has unpicked for us. And here are some. Most important: individual change happens through safe and trusting relationships. We engage with vision, we challenge our cognitive errors. We can be good coping role models, addressing resistance and helping to build motivation. And this here, the arithmetic of compassion, gives some support to us in recognizing what we can do together to happen. And here are some of the processes socially. Change has to be relationship-based across disciplines, as we're sharing here. We've got to understand, I mentioned for myself earlier in this talk, we reach out, we've got to appreciate our different identities and values, especially across the politics. This is not just a concern. We've got to find ways of talking to our colleagues who share different political values. We've got to end the politics. The Climate and Ecological Emergencies Bill is the political process that those of us who are concerned with rebellion are currently supporting. And as community psychologists, we want prescribing social action rather than drugs and therapies, building alliances and building bridges. To build trust, we need effective communication, as I said earlier, across our values. We need civil conversation. Perhaps the most important thing all of us can do as individuals is talk to our friends, to our neighbours, keep the conversation alive politically. We can speak out, conversations, not monologues. We can footprint as role models, but we can be kind to ourselves as well. We can't possibly take this on as really on our own shoulders. The rules need to be changed. And for some of us, it involves taking to the streets. I'm really pleased that some of my ex-R psychology colleagues, here we are in London back in September. And again, Tony and I, 2 years ago, spoke to our professional body about climate should be at the agenda, and we were met with blank incomprehension. It's changing fast, and we've produced a special issue of our professional journal, seeing the voices that are really effective and powerful within our profession. Caring for our home is something that we share and needs economic change. The economist Kate Raworth is very inspiring with her circular inspiration that goes back to circles that I was drawing earlier in my talk. Back to my theme for today. Care for our home. There's no reason, as Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, says, reason why anybody who's been conceived shouldn't be given the opportunity to live a happy life. And we can all do and engage with the things that matter to us. For her, it was planting trees. She developed a mass movement to counter deforestation through democracy, through women's rights, and through international solidarity. Thinking globally, but acting locally. We do this because we love our children. Treat the earth well. It was not given to you, parents. It is loaned to you by your children. And my final picture there is my little grandson, Lowen, on his walk, his regular walk down to the meadow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie. Apologise to everyone for the poor sound quality there. We obviously just have a few bandwidth problems, but Annie is actually currently on the International Space Station, so I suppose that's not surprising. We're going to move on, have questions and answers at the end. We're going to move on and to our second speaker, who is David Horrell. And David is Professor of New Testament Studies and Director of the Centre for Biblical Studies in the University of Exeter's Department of Theology and Religion. The main focus of his teaching and research is the history and literature of earliest Christianity and the interpretation of the Christian Bible. From 2006 to 2009, he led a research project on uses of the Bible in environmental ethics and has continued an interest in the ways in which biblical texts shape Christian and post-Christian attitudes and responses to the environmental crises. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. First challenge is going to be to share my screen, so I shall seek to do that where that begins, I think, and hopefully I can then run that from the beginning. Can you all see?
We can see it, yes. Thanks, David.
Has it begun the slide? That's the next question. There we are.
Well, perfect. Thank you.
You can hear me, see me, and see a slide. This is excellent. Well, it's a good start, at least. Thank you very much, Tim, for the invitation and the welcome. I'm conscious that this may seem a somewhat unusual topic to include in a series such as this, and particularly from someone who, as Tim's kind introduction noted, spends his time looking at the history and ethics of earliest Christianity and the interpretation of texts from the Christian Bible. What I hope to do today is to convince you that engaging with how religion and Christianity in particular, which is what I know a bit about, influences responses to the environmental crisis is a really important part of the overall picture in thinking about this planetary crisis we're discussing. That's particularly so perhaps because in Western secular societies, or so-called secular societies, religion and religious commitment are often regarded as a private matter, a distinct kind of separable area of our lives. However, religious convictions and indeed wider religious traditions and worldviews shape and are shaped by our living in the world, our ethics, our politics, our view of other creatures, including other humans. And this is the view made here by Craig Colquhoun. And it's important to stress, I won't read out the whole of the quotation, but to stress that these influences go beyond the lives of those committed to or involved in religious communities. As he says, religions matter in public not simply as sets of beliefs, but because they motivate their members and communities and networks to take action. And beyond that, they help to sort of call attention more generally to important themes and questions, not just on, as it were, specifically religious topics. Now, he mentions here things that are important and topical: money, migration, race, sex, gender, and so on, but doesn't actually mention the key thing I'm talking about today, and we're concerned with: the environmental crisis. To illustrate this point, I want to first of all to move on to put up a hugely influential biblical text on the next slide. It's from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, the opening chapter of the Jewish scriptures, the Christian Old Testament. And again, you can read the whole quotation, but I've underlined a few particular phrases which have enormous resonance and influence down through the ages. In particular, for example, that idea of humanity made in the image of God has undergirded, at least in the Western Christian tradition in particular, a sense of human uniqueness and distinct dignity. You can only have to begin to let your mind run through the influences of that kind of notion in medical as well as in ecological ethics. It was also a key text inspiring the rise of modern Western science. Think of figures like Francis Bacon in the 16th, 17th century. The idea that the human vocation was to understand, to manage, indeed to subdue and to control nature for human benefit was one of the kind of the driving senses of vocation that moved some of those early Western scientists. However, with those 2 points, you may have already begun to think that this text perhaps also raises certain problematic issues for us in an age of ecological crisis. Indeed, this was precisely the case, famously argued. I was glad to hear Annie refer back to some of those classic works like Rachel Carson's from the 1960s, because this one is also from the 1960s, famously argued by Lynn White Jr., a medieval historian, in 1967. So in this now classic article, Lynn White argued that with new inventions like the medieval plough and the coming to dominance of the Western Christian worldview, humans became able and felt divinely encouraged to exploit nature for their own benefit. And White provocatively argued that Christianity in particular, not least through that text in Genesis that we just looked at, established a dualism of, excuse the 60s language, man and nature, humanity and nature, but also insisted that it's God's will that humans exploit nature for their own benefit. Western Christianity, White argued, is therefore the most anthropocentric, the most human-centered religion the world has seen. So the provocative charge of the article, at least in part, was that Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt in relation to our modern ecologic crisis. Now, there's been a great deal of critical response to White's charge since then. One key move has been to reinterpret the Genesis text, and indeed to thus to challenge and to reshape its legacy, to focus in particular on the idea of stewardship. And that's become one of, if not the most prominent motifs in some environmental discussion more widely, but certainly in a lot of Christian and Christian-related charitable approaches to this topic. You can see this, for example, in two quotations I've given you. One comes from the publication in 2008 of the Green Bible. This is from an evangelical Protestant, Calvin DeWitt. You can see here explicitly how dominion is, if you like, shifted or interpreted to mean not kind of harsh domination, but caring stewardship. And then a second very similar quotation from Pope Francis' fairly recent 2015 encyclical Laudato Si'. So as I say, this image of stewardship has become prominent in many churches and environmental charities, although there are questions about its adequacy as a model to understand our relationship to other creatures and our place in our ecosystems. Also challenging and influential, for good and perhaps for ill, are biblical depictions of the future, and specifically hopes for some kind of end to the current world and its sufferings. Now again, I hope you'll forgive me following through my biblical scholar's instincts and putting texts in front of you for you to have a look at. Having put up that one from Genesis, here are two really influential texts from the New Testament that give somewhat contrasting pictures. The first one is a text from the second letter of Peter. Again, I've underlined particular parts of it, but you can read it for yourselves. This text stresses the idea of a sudden coming of the day of the Lord when it's not necessarily expected, but that this is a day of a kind of fiery end which dissolves the heavens and the earth, and when the earth is replaced with a new one. The second text is from Paul's letter to the Romans and provides one of the most iconic New Testament texts used again by Christian charities from Tear Fund to Christian Aid and others. This idea of creation groaning in bondage to decay, but hoping for liberation from that decay. And as you might imagine, these end-time scenarios have influenced Christian thought and indeed wider cultural instincts in a variety of ways. And I think it's worth pointing out, not least because we're often shaped by it unaware, how influential this sense of linear time has become, this idea of moving towards an end that may be quite close. I mean, other religions and cultural and philosophical traditions have had a much more cyclical view of time, for example. So I was interested to find a 2015 article, for example, on the popularity, sorry, that word telos there, the Greek word telos means kind of the end or goal towards which things are moving. The 2015 article on the popularity of all sorts of Hollywood end-of-the-world films points to the influence of the Bible in these kinds of apocalyptic destructive scenarios, which range, of course, across all sorts of types, from kind of final battles to climatic disaster, many of which are influenced by biblical imagery. And I'm sure the psychological impact of this kind of thinking about time is worth considering. It's also worth considering how it shapes our particular sense of ecological crisis and human futures, whether helpfully or not. And as another picture illustrates, one not from a Hollywood film, but from a Christian website, some Christians view us as at a very particular point in time, right near the very end. You can see the nearing midnight, 23:55, which I suppose is always a reminder to a speaker to keep on time, isn't it? So in some Christian circles, the real imminent threat is seen as God's fiery judgment, and this is what people should be prepared for. Crises and destruction on earth may even be signs, seen as signs of an imminent end, given biblical warnings about earthquakes, famines, and wars being things that would happen in the run-up to this anticipated end. And for some, the priority should be evangelism to save souls, giving the coming divine judgment, rather than to save the planet itself. You'll see from this, this particular kind of cartoon here, and you might notice as well the biblical text, which is quoted there, the very one we've just seen from the second letter of Peter. And this kind of perspective often goes hand in hand with a skepticism about climate change and climate science, as in the quotation I've given you there. Indeed, among some conservative evangelical Christian groups, environmentalism may be seen as a kind of neo-pagan liberal threat to true Christian priorities, as in the imaging of this threat as a kind of green dragon, again, picking up biblical imagery. Lest you think of this as just some really kind of marginal sort of wacky viewpoint, as it were, it's worth mentioning, I think, its influence on at least contemporary politics. So here's a news item from a few years ago, I think it's 2016 or thereabouts, where pastors praised Trump for skipping UN panel on imaginary climate crisis to focus on a real religious problem. And I mean, the influence of that on things like the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Climate Agreement is, of course, of much wider global importance. And it's worth noting that in 2016, Donald Trump won 81% of the white evangelical vote in the USA and 75% of that vote in 2020. As with the arguments about dominion and its transformation, if you like, into stewardship, here too there are efforts to reinterpret these biblical visions differently. And the key move here is to see them not as visions of destruction, but rather visions of transformation. I rather like that somewhat romantic Victorian image from William Strutt. I particularly like it, of course, given where we are, many of us at least sitting, where I'm certainly sitting in Exeter, that he happened to be an artist from Teignmouth in Devon, depicting the rather idyllic image from the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 11, where however implausible in terms of evolutionary science, the wolf lies down with the lamb and the lion eats straw like the ox. But this sort of vision of a peaceable, restored, transformed creation. But in this way then, visions of the future, not least biblical and Christian visions of the future of the earth, may be reclaimed as visions of transformation which promote a human responsibility to act in a way that aligns with the kind of peaceable, reconciled, flourishing depictions of that new future for the earth. Care for creation becomes a prominent catchphrase and something that has been a dominant part of the campaigning of many Christian environmental charities, such as A. Rocha with their eco-congregation initiatives, for which the Climate Sunday is one example. So I offer just a few conclusions which I hope pull together some of the key points I've tried to illustrate. I'm conscious I've unusually, having been lecturing for quite a long time and realizing that the risk of running over time is one that perennially haunts most of us. I've been reasonably concise here, but hopefully that will be useful in terms of allowing time for discussion of both the presentations. So I'm already moving on to my final slide, which just gives three conclusions based on what I've been presenting. So the first very broad conclusion, but one which I hope is of relevance, or at least I hope I've convinced you that it's of relevance to all of us, whether we share anything of those religious convictions and worldviews or not, that they shape attitudes and actions, beliefs and behaviors in the world more than we often think. And even at the level of our conception of time, the way in which we conceive the time in which our lives are lived, the sense that time might be moving towards an end, perhaps even our sense that the end of the world might be coming upon us. Secondly, and again, whether these convictions are ones we share or not, that religious texts, and the Christian Bible in particular, from where I've taken my illustrations, carry significant legacies through history, particularly, of course, in the West and in Christian cultures, carry legacies which are open to a range of interpretations and indeed are interpreted anew and afresh in ever-changing contexts. So just as the book of Genesis inspired the rise of some scientific endeavor in the 16th century, so now it calls for new and different interpretations and can hopefully inspire new kinds of actions in an ecologically conscious 21st century. So our awareness of ecological crisis and unsustainable patterns of human living prompts new ways of understanding the religious traditions that in turn shape many people's beliefs and actions. And again, in a secular Western context, it's easy to forget how many millions and millions of people are affected by something like whether directly by reading it or by its teaching and its perspectives being filtered through priests and preachers and so on, something like Pope Francis' ecological encyclical Laudato Si, for example. And at the very least, we might hope that such reinterpretation of those religious texts and traditions help to ensure that those traditions do not hinder a positive and creative and helpful response to the ecological crisis, and may even play some part in creatively and positively generating new responses in both belief and behavior to the challenge that it poses us. Thank you very much. And whether I can now stop sharing my screen is the next challenge, but hopefully I can.
That's all right, don't worry. Thank you very much, David. That's fantastic. Tinmouth certainly looked very different in those days, didn't it? Although I note there was still somebody burning tyres or something on one of the tours in the background. If you look carefully at the picture. So you weren't too worried about atmospheric pollution. If you've got questions for speakers, can you put your questions in the chat and I'll ask them directly. I want to start, actually, David, while you're there, with you and this idea of time and our focus on time and being time limited, and that something is. There's always been this idea that the end of the world is soon and possibly just around the corner, and that's been through centuries, through millennia. But there's a difference, isn't there? There's two aspects here. There's our personal time on Earth, and the wider concept of our community, our civilization, in terms of planetary health, our contemporary society, and how we look forward and think of the next generations. I mean, does a theological look try to distinguish between those two? About how we tease out the important differences between those two aspects, because we're all time limited in some way, but as a species, it has a different consequence.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I suppose I mean, it also, I mean, in a sense, reflects the fact that our often unconscious models of who we are as human beings, individually and collectively, shapes that kind of sense as well of, you know, the individual life and its beginning and end, and what it means to think of that individual life, and so on. I mean, I'm as it will have become immediately clear to people, no scientist, no medic, but it does seem to me that both in terms of a sense of time, but also in terms of what we are as a creature, that the sort of culturally, religiously informed instincts often shape our views more than we realize. So we tend to think of our individual body, and it might get invaded by a virus or not. We don't tend to think of our body as a community of you know, whatever, you know, sort of gut bacteria and everything else that is sustaining us as a kind of moderately healthily functioning person. So it's a kind of non-answer, but I think, and it, you know, as I was thinking about that section of the talk, I was very conscious that a sense of sort of impending threat or impending end, or at least catastrophe, I mean, can be helpful and unhelpful. I mean, I'm not necessarily wanting to say it's, you know, that we should simply, you know, we would be helped more if we didn't have that sense of time, but just to reflect on its impacts on us, for good and for ill. And you know, I mean, I think Annie's stuff about the psychological challenges of eco-crisis is very relevant there. It was a point of connection I wasn't necessarily expecting to pick up.
Annie, let's bring you in on this, because in healthcare, we often, you know, in my background with neurodegenerative disorders, and in your background with working renal patients, we're often dealing with chronic, incurable disease that we know the patient will have for the rest of their life, and will, you know, sooner or later may well be the demise of them. And yet, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, you know, I'm sure you can probably put it better than I can, but extraordinary the range of human responses you get to that. Do you want to come in on this time concept of how we differentiate between our own personal futures and the futures of what we care about in our communities?
Yes, I loved that aspect of thinking about. Felt that was a really in our talks, and I missed one of my slides, which was just as well because I went on too long anyway. But the one about facing existential challenges, and how my work as a renal psychologist, working with people facing death, and how they dealt with it. There was a brilliant interview with Michael J. Fox just this weekend in The Guardian about his experience of living with Parkinson's disease. And he spoke about how the thing that kept him going was gratitude. But then reading his account, he had a lot of resources that were available to him. And what it seems to me, working with people with end-stage kidney disease, that it's the indebtedness between us that makes a difference. I search with people who come forward as altruistic kidney donors, and they were initially, back in 2006 when this first became possible, were said to be mad by many people. Everybody who spoke to them said there must be something wrong with you. But yeah, I think cultural. All of these people we did our research with said that they felt interconnected. They felt that sense. The phrase that used was, what goes round comes round. And I think that links maybe with this shifting towards this idea of time, back to maybe the time as cyclical rather than linear.
Interesting. And of course, we had this, I think a couple of weeks ago, looking more from the historical perspective from Amanda Power, those who were with us for webinar 2, looking at how important it is to understand things in the cultural context of which they've evolved, you know, historical cultural context, but also, as we've seen today, the belief set in which our thoughts have evolved. I'm going to bring in, I think David Pension has asked a question in the chat. In fact, David, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, your point about about healthcare and the problem about how we actually are often too busy doing one thing and not have time to do another. You always want to unmute yourself there, David, or we can do it for you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Tim. No, I was very struck. Both fantastic presentations. Wonderful, wonderful. It just struck a chord with me. I mean, I've worked for a lot of time in the NHS, and a very interesting thing happened to me where I once told a friend of mine who worked for the synod that a lot of doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals often don't take climate change seriously because, as I put in the chat box, they say, I'm too busy saving patients to save the planet. I.e., in a sense, they're doing their good bit. They part their bit. And I told this to a colleague in the synod, and he said, gosh, that's extraordinary, because he was doing a talk at the synod on climate change, and someone came up to him afterwards and said, I really respect what you do, but I'm too busy saving souls to save the planet. And it's just struck me that there's a phenomenon which Tim and I have spoken about frequently, which is the paradox of noble organizations, which I think is something that says those people or organizations that institutionally have a higher calling, paradoxically take the broader issues of the world poorly, because they're already engaged in something rather noble, and they tend to be bad employers, not very good corporate citizens, and the four that are often quoted, and then I'll shut up, are the health service, universities, faith organizations, and charities. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I think that's what we've discussed before, isn't it, Tim? Something like that.
Indeed. Thank you, David. I'm just looking at the chat here to look for a question. I was going to say, actually, to anyone else, the other way of putting a question is to put up your hand in the participants box, and we should see it, and we can then unmute you and you can say your question live. What I wanted to steer this round to is also, Annie, well, I suppose for both speakers really, is our place, the way we see our place within the wider community, because planetary health to me is a question of extremes, of tremendous dimensional extremes, from the absolutely what's going on the the atomic molecular level in terms of ecotoxicology, right up to the planetary level in terms of climate change, and even beyond that. And in temporal scales as well, we know that we're seeing massive species loss, which we haven't seen before. The sixth mass extinction that we're facing at the moment, which we haven't seen before in eons of Earth's history. And getting our heads round moving between the very small and the very large in all those dimensions is extremely difficult, I think, for us as human beings. And I want to bring this on to the psychological aspects of how you move between the individual faith, or the individual concept that we have of our own self, and the concept we have of the wider self, whether it's our community, our town, our village, our community, our university, our hospital, but expanding that to our national and global concept, and how we deal with that. Annie, can I bring you in there to tell us a little bit about the psychology of actually moving between those extremes?
Well, I think the first thing to say is we all, and especially under conditions of distress and stress, tend to think in black and white, either or terms. Maybe it's a Western phenomenon, but to me, it seems like it's not either or. It's not individual responsibility. It's not collective responsibility. It's straddling that middle ground. There's a great book, Too Hot, The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change, by Rebecca Willis, and she talks about this idea of staying with the bubble, not into either one of those two extremes. staying with it collectively and individually both. And also I would just urge people, if there's one thing you follow up from this talk by me, it's that website, The Arithmetic of Compassion. It's a psychology based organisation, and it is about looking at what are the cognitive biases that lead us to think that there's nothing as individuals, and to join the dots between what we do individually and what we do collectively.
No, thank you, Annie. I was going to say both the slides from both speakers will be available on the Webinar 4 website, maybe later today or tomorrow. So you can get the links from there. David, can I bring in you, David Horrell? Can bring you in for a comment from the theological aspects of how from religion we move from the fate of the individual to the fate of our communities or nations or whatever, moving to the larger scale.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, theology that does that sometimes a little bit more smoothly than we can in psychology. I don't know, but
yeah, I mean, thanks, Tim. I've been sort of looking at the chat as well and sort of thinking of trying to, I mean, be concise, but make comments that will maybe pick up a few of the things that people have said, because I think, yeah, again, I mean, that challenge not to see the individual and the kind of corporate and collective as kind of either ors. I mean, Annie's comment about black and white and so on, but, you know, and that again, I mean, I suppose cultural and religious traditions, that's where that Genesis 1 text has carried an enormous weight. I mean, it's not the only thing, but the distinctness of human beings as opposed to everything and everyone else. And actually you can say, well, that's not necessarily the most ecologically or scientifically sustainable view of ourselves, and we can maybe break down some of that duality. And then in terms of engagement with religious communities, not least conservative Christians and so on, I mean, I think, you know, one of the values of engaging biblical texts in this kind of discussion is partly to draw attention to other biblical texts and other ways in which the tradition has resources to help us think about this. I mean, the Genesis 1 text about humans made in the image of God is actually really quite an unusual idea within the whole biblical tradition. And there's some, you know, there are other texts which stress the way in which land, people, flourishing are very interconnected, and so on. And I suppose somebody mentioned the sort of command about love of neighbor and so on. I mean, part of the sort of creative constructive challenge is to think about how, I mean, a kind of key ethical command like that is the ways in which it can be rethought afresh. I mean, there's care for other human beings. I mean, to what extent are other living creatures our neighbors? To what extent can there be a kind of ecological reconfiguring of what care for the other might mean, for example? That's a bit of a hasty response to lots of really interesting questions in the chat.
And it's not just, I mean, you're obviously focusing on Christianity, and that because that's your area of expertise. But I mean, there are parallels here in whatever, you know, multiple religions across the globe, and it's so there is something innate psychologically, or the way that these concepts arise. You know, going back to that Genesis quote, in the image of God doesn't necessarily mean physically, but it can be the psychological makeup, the spiritual makeup of how we as a species think and think these things through. And of course, we see it in the global corporations and the way, you know, our relationship with them and responsibility and things like that is mirrored yet again, from the very small to the very large. And, you know, interesting. We're coming, I think, towards the end now. We're just reached the end of time. Is there anyone who wants to speak? Just put your hand up in the chat. I'm briefly looking through the lots of references to talk about, and I think there's a lot of food for thought there. I'm going to call this to a close now, and actually, I think both speakers have done remarkably well, condensing an awful lot into actually quite a short time to speak. So thank you very, very much indeed to both our speakers today. And of course, thank you to Riptide for providing us with the poem, which I think is set us starting at the beginning. Join us again next week if you can, at same time, 12:30. Next week, we'll be looking at more of the physical constituents of life, of the food we eat, the things we consume, the physical stuff, and we'll hope to see you all again. Hope to see you all again then. Thank you very much.